Hi, and welcome to Ivy English. I'm Karen.
And I'm Chris Gorski.
Today is November 13th, and we're on page 36 of your magazines, and today we're going to hear part 2 of the article that we started yesterday, and I hope you tuned in yesterday because it's a really, really interesting piece about an author and a book that I really love. The author's name is Charlotte Bronte, and the book is Jane Eyre. Our title is Jane Eyre, A Tale of Trial and Triumph.
We have been talking about several classics, and I'm really looking forward to kind of getting the cliff notes, so to speak, of Jane Eyre. There's two ways you can look at the articles we've been discussing, whether it's Charlotte's Web or Jane Eyre or The Little Prince. If you've read it before, then you get to learn some history and background. If you've never read it before, you get a little preview, and perhaps we're encouraging you to take a look at some of these great books and at least help you understand the most important parts.
After hearing the article in its entirety, you may be tantalized, and you may want to go and read the book if you haven't already. To be tantalized means to kind of tempt somebody on purpose to try to attract their interest, and it's spelled T-A-N-T-A-L-I-Z-E-D. T-A-L-I-Z-E and final D, to be tantalized. So maybe after hearing today's article, you'll be tantalized and want to read the book Jane Eyre. So let's get started. Our title again is Jane Eyre, A Tale of Trial and Triumph. After 2 years of teaching at Lowood, Jane decides to look for other opportunities. Jane is hired as a governess, a position Charlotte Bronte held herself for a time, for a young girl at Thornfield Hall. Shortly after her arrival, Jane meets Mr. Rochester, the owner of the house and the young girl's guardian. While she is at Thornfield, a series of strange accidents occur, including a fire in Rochester's room from which Jane saves him. Jane falls in love with Rochester and agrees to marry him. However, their wedding day is interrupted when a lawyer declares that Rochester is already married to Bertha, a mentally ill woman he keeps locked in the attic, and who is responsible for the bizarre occurrences at Thornfield.
Following the failed wedding, Rochester proposes they live together unmarried in France. Shocked and upset, Jane flees in the middle of the night. As she travels, she loses her luggage and runs out of money. Hungry and near the point of collapse, Jane is rescued by the Rivers family. When she recovers, she is informed by St. John Rivers that an uncle whose identity was concealed from her as a child has died and left her a small fortune. He also reveals that he and his sisters are Jane's cousins. With the security of her uncle's money, Jane is finally free to take control of her life. She turns down a proposal from St. John and travels back to Thornfield. Upon her arrival, she finds the house burned and discovers that Bertha died and Rochester lost a hand and was blinded in the fire. Despite his injuries, Jane is still in love with Rochester and marries him in the end.
Happy
what
ending.
An ending. Oh, my God.
Yeah, I think we might think it's a little corny now, but the book works. I just really enjoyed this book a lot. Let's go back to the beginning. After 2 years of teaching at Lowood, Jane decides to look for other opportunities. So if she was that miserable there as a student, I'm thinking that she's kind of stuck there as a teacher, like she's not moving on in her life. She's just in this very narrow and not very pleasant world all the time.
This is literally the exact thought on my mind. Think of her situation. So she's at a school she hated, where in her real life, her 2 older sisters die there. This is not a very happy situation, but she takes a job. And remember, this is a boarding school. She has to live there. So either she is kind of a strange person, or because she's a woman, her opportunities are very narrow and very limited. This is the best situation she can get. And for most women in the past, a teaching position was the only truly good job you could have outside the home.
And that is really true, because if you read some of these novels, you'll find out that women over and over again find work as a governess. So somebody who lives in somebody's house and teaches their kids. It's not usually a really wonderful job because it probably did not pay very well. Often the kids are wild. They don't necessarily want to learn. So if any of you have been a tutor, you have sort of an idea of what it's like, except you're there all the time. You have to take care of them, their clothes and their getting up and cleaning and everything else. That's all your responsibility. So it's not a wonderful job, but like Chris said, it was one of the better opportunities open to women at the time.
Charlotte Bronte was a teacher and a governess, as we learned. To be honest, she hated it. If you read her letters, they're really quite passionate about how much she dislikes the job. She says the hours are too long. The kids are not diligent.
Yeah.
The books they gave her aren't very good. And when I was reading her letters about being a teacher, I kept thinking, she sounds just like a teacher today.
That's right. Things don't change.
Things don't change. The more they change, the more they stay the same.
That's right. The same was true of her sister Anne. Anne also got a job as governess, and she complained constantly about the same things.
They're shy girls, and now they're living with this huge family with, like you said, wild, noisy children. She has to teach them and entertain them. She was a person that didn't like to look at you in the face. She much preferred her letters and her pen. Now she's trying to chase these children around the house.
And often the
parents...
No
wonder she would hate it.
Yeah, and often the parents indulge the children. They will stand on the children's side even when they're wrong, so it was really not easy. Next sentence, Jane is hired as a governess, a position Charlotte Bronte held herself for a time for a young girl at Thornfield Hall. So this describes her next step in life. So after she graduated from this school where she was miserable, she taught for 2 years, was miserable. So she thought, I have to do something else. So she found a job as a live-in nanny, and she was to take care of one little girl with a man who was apparently single. It was just the father there with the kid, and he needed a woman to look after the child. So that was her situation. It was a big house, a little girl, and her father. And the name of the house, it was a pretty big, fancy house for the time, so it had a name. It was called Thornfield Hall. Shortly after her arrival, Jane meets Mr. Rochester, the owner of the house and the young girl's guardian. Now, this sentence is pretty easy and pretty straightforward, easy to understand. The one word you may not know is guardian. So guardian is the person who is responsible for somebody else who has less power, who's younger. It's often a child. So the young girl's guardian, he was in fact the father.
If you live in America, we will always give letters that say to the parent or guardian of, and then the student's name, because we never want to make the assumption. A lot of times in America, your students may not live with your mother or with their mother or father. They have a grandmother or maybe even a grandfather or an uncle taking care of the child. This guardian, if you live in the United States, will become a common word if your child is in school.
Now, I'm just wondering, since we come from the same culture, basically, when did you first notice this, that guardian was added onto parent? About how old were you when you first noticed?
So I entered school, I'd say in 1988, and I recall it from a very early time because I didn't know what it meant. And I remember asking, guardian, maybe they're living with grandma or aunt. And instead of saying to the parents or grandma or uncle or aunt or whatever, it's easier to use this word guardian.
So we come in contact with this word very, very early. I'm thinking for me it was around first grade.
Interesting.
I think that's what my mind tells me. And I also have the same question. Why is it so wordy? It's just your parents who do it, right? So I made the assumption that everybody had a situation like me. I grew up with a father who was married to my mother, and it stayed that way till they died.
Right.
So things are not always like that. So you learn early on that people have different situations. Next sentence, while she is at Thornfield, a series of strange accidents occur, including a fire in Rochester's room from which Jane saves him. Now, here we have a lot of drama already. So she's been there for a while, and then a fire starts in the house, and then Jane is the one to go and save Rochester.
If I became rich, I would give my house a name, and I keep thinking what I would call it. And I know this isn't really important, but Thornfield Hall, that sounds so good. Like, Do you have a name for that, what you would call your house?
I do actually.
Do you really? Okay.
No, but it's not
happy.
a fancy name.
Oh.
But the thing is, I personify my house because I live alone. So sometimes I talk to the house. I'll say, goodbye, house, when I go.
You just call it house.
Yeah, and it's not a house. It's an apartment, but I grew up in a house. So house for me is the word for home. So now that sounds like a really silly thing that I'm revealing to everybody. But for me, it's a kind of gratitude because I think I'm lucky to live here. I like where I live. I redecorated it myself. And it's secure and everything is fine. So it's a kind of act of gratitude every day. Thank you again when I wake up in the morning. Thank you, Taiwan, that I have this one more day to live in this wonderful place. I do this every day.
It's a beautiful habit. I'm a very nostalgic person. When I left home on vacation earlier this year, when I left my mom's house, I said in my heart, like, goodbye to the house.
Yeah.
I didn't vocalize it, but I have that same feeling. But to be fair, I didn't I didn't give it the name house.
Thornfield Howell or anything, or house. No, I say house, sort of like talking to a pet.
Yeah.
Okay, so this place has a fancy name, Thornfield Hall. Thorn, it's a plant. It's a part of a plant that will stick you, can make you bleed if you touch it in the wrong way. Field is a large expansion, a large piece of land that apparently is covered with thorny plants, which is where they got the name Thornfield. Okay, and from which, so there was a fire and Jane saved him. Now, how are we going to put those two thoughts together? She saved him from the fire in the room, or she saved him from the room would also work too. We can't say, including a fire in Rochester's room, which Jane saves him, it's from which. So watch out for that preposition. Next sentence, Jane falls in love with Rochester and agrees to marry him. Now, that one's really straightforward. It sounds straight out of Disney. Okay, and it's a very normal kind of situation. If a man has been married, but for some reason the wife is not around anymore, usually the window that people give men on dating sites is 2 weeks.
So, meaning
that men and women are actually quite different. Men have a lot of testosterone. They have a very strong need to have a partner. Women can go a pretty long time without a partner, and we're fine.
And men will need 2 weeks to find a partner.
The window is about 2 weeks, and within 2 weeks, men will usually find a partner. So if there's a guy who becomes available and single, ladies, you have to get in there before the 2 weeks is up or someone else has got him.
Boy, I must be ugly or something. It was really hard for me to find girlfriends, but okay. Listen, I'm married, so I'm lucky. So.
You were picky, yeah. But I'm saying for guys in general, especially, for a woman like over 30, if they want to find somebody, a guy in the same age group, most of the men are already taken. It's because men are just not going to go that long without a partner. That's just the way it is.
I think if you met a single man today, the assumption is divorce. But in Jane Eyre, if you have a single man, it's because of death. Your wife died young. This is at a time when people still aren't living easily into their 70s or 80s. This is a time where it's quite easy to die. And I think this is the assumption Jane Eyre makes, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. But actually, there were a lot of bad marriages then as now. It was no different. And it was harder to get a divorce and people looked down on it, but marriages fell apart as well. So maybe it was the assumption, but failure in marriage was also very common. Okay, so next sentence. However, their wedding day is interrupted when a lawyer declares that Rochester is already married to Bertha, a mentally ill woman he keeps locked in the attic, and who is responsible for the bizarre occurrences at Thornfield. Now, this is a long and somewhat complex sentence, but not difficult. And after you read a novel, maybe many years later, you don't remember all the details. There were a lot of parts of Jane Eyre that I had forgotten. But as it mentions this part of the book is very, very clear in my memory. They're already having the ceremony, and somebody gets up before they are actually pronounced man and wife and says, this marriage must be stopped. He is already married. That scene sticks really strongly in my mind.
People, like Mr. Rochester is supposedly like the hero for Jane Eyre, but he's a terrible guy. I don't know why we overlook this. He has a mentally ill wife. He locked her in the attic, but to be fair to him, he wasn't doing anything especially strange in his day. This was common treatment, quote unquote, for the mentally ill of his day. But he's agreeing to marry this woman while his wife is still alive and very, very sick. He's a bad guy. Why are we forgetting this?
That's a really strong value judgment. I have a different point of view.
Okay.
Because he could have just thrown her out and ignored her. he actually did a really gallant thing by keeping her there, and he hired a woman named Grace Poole to take care of her. He spent his own money for somebody to look after his wife, his mentally ill wife, because Jane was asking, well, who are these people? And then she had no idea. Nobody would tell her. So he hired somebody to take care of her, and I don't think he was abusive. He fed her. He did keep her locked up, but she was really loony. She was really crazy, and he did have someone take care of her.
I think the next sentence so I'm saying he's a bad guy. Karen's on the side that he was caring, but maybe in a way we don't accept today. I think the next sentence perhaps could change our mind. But before we get there, I do want to make a side story here. So Charlotte Bronte also fell in love with a married man, her teacher while she was living abroad. And she was very shy in person, but she was a very passionate letter writer. And she's an excellent writer. She really is. And so she writes these very passionate letters to her married teacher, and he receives them, and he doesn't reply. Instead, he cuts the letters into little pieces. But his wife finds them, and understandably, she's quite upset. But for some reason, and I don't know the truth of this why, they don't get rid of the letters. They hold on to these cut-up letters, and you can actually go to the British Library and see these passionate, love-filled letters she writes to her married teacher that reflects this relationship she has in Jane Eyre.
I didn't know any of this. I knew about her affair, and I knew that her biography writer was told to cover it up. She thought, we can't let, future people know about all these things going on with her. They'll judge her. But I didn't know about that. I'll have to look that one up.
She says, and I want to read one line from this because I think it's really quite beautiful. She says, I would undergo the greatest bodily pains than have my heart constantly lacerated by searing regrets. She knows she's doing something wrong. Unkind here, right?
Yeah.
To lacerate is to cut. To sear is to burn. But she has to confess her love to this person.
Okay. So judging whether somebody did something good or bad, that's all kind of subjective. We can't really say one thing or the other. I think in Rochester's situation, for the time, at least he was taking care of her. Let's go on to the next paragraph.
Following the failed wedding, Rochester proposes they live together unmarried in France. I stick with that he's a bad guy.
But I don't, because he can't divorce his wife.
You are 100% correct in all of this. So this is a time when getting divorced is very uneasy.
It's very hard.
Sending your wife away to a mental institution or a lunatic asylum, as they were called at the time, was basically forcing them into a place where they awaited death.
It would be sending them to their death.
I agree that keeping her in an attic was far better than to send them away. I agree with you on that, but I still stand by that. I don't know. You make the decision. Where do you stand on this?
Oh, you have to read the book.
Yeah.
Okay, so here it says that he suggested they just live together, and that sounds so modern, doesn't it? Because It was shocking in the 60s and 70s when I first started hearing about it. I was a little kid then. It was shocking, and that was America. Well, the 60s and 70s, that was a period of sexual revolution in the U.S. when people started being sort of okay with this. But back in the 19th century, this was really, really shocking, especially from a woman's point of view. Men did this stuff all the time. Maybe they'd find a woman who would keep quiet about it, or maybe she was a prostitute or something or whatever. But for a well-educated woman, this is just terribly shocking.
And for a woman to be writing the idea of this, of living with an unmarried man away, presumably having a sexual relationship, this is quite a shocking thing for the 19th century.
And this is how she reacted?
Shocked and upset, Jane flees in the middle of the night. To flee means to run away.
So how dare you suggest that I do such a thing? And let's just go by what we know about the story as it is. She was probably a virgin. At the time, it was a big deal that you do not have sex before you get married. So she wanted to have, she keeps herself pure, doesn't have sex before she's married. And here this guy says, oh, let's just live together. I mean, what did I wait all this time for? So she's very unhappy. She's very shocked. She thinks that if I stay here, I probably will agree, because if you're in love with somebody, you're going to start making compromises. So she thinks the only thing I can do is get away from this situation. That gives me no good choices. So
as she travels, she loses her luggage and runs out of money.
Now, this is the place I was telling Chris before we started recording the program. This is the part of the novel that I think is unconvincing, and it's exaggerated, and it really strains credulity. I mean, it's hard to believe. So she loses her luggage. She runs out of money. She doesn't even have enough to eat. So it describes in the book that she's crawling on the ground. She doesn't have the energy to walk. So she's crawling, and it's in an area with very few houses. There are almost no people there. No money, no food. What is she going to do? It's really a bad situation, and it's unbelievable. So anyway, she is
hungry and near the point of collapse. Jane is rescued by the Rivers family.
All right. So she is really, literally, really hungry. And I bet a lot of us don't even have the experience of being very hungry. She is going to faint pretty soon. But right at that time, she sees a house, and she goes there and to see if she can get some food, just some food and water. So this family says, oh my goodness, what happened to you? They take her in, and their family name is Rivers.
When she recovers, she is informed by St. John Rivers, that says St. John, but it's pronounced St. John Rivers, that an uncle whose identity was concealed from her as a child has died and left her a small fortune. Wow.
Now, this is part of that whole part of the novel that I think is so unbelievable. It's just not easy to accept this. It just sounds a little bit too exaggerated to be possible. And by the way, St. John here, pronounced St. John. Sometimes that happens in English, especially British English. I come from a city called St. Paul, but the cathedral in London is called St. Paul.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They don't say St. Paul's Cathedral, it's St. Paul's.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's a very similar thing. St. John, St. John, St. Paul, St. Paul. Okay. So she's been saved by these people. She's now staying with them. Then she finds out instead of being totally bankrupt, broke, with not enough money even for food and no water, she suddenly has money. And she's found long-lost family.
She also reveals that he and his sisters are Jane's cousins. Wow.
Okay, let's go on.
With the security of her uncle's money, Jane is finally free to take control of her life.
And I think that's also pretty easy to understand. If you have money, then you have some kind of safety, then your life is sort of taken care of. You can make your own decisions.
She turns down a proposal from St. John and travels back to Thornfield.
Why does she turn it down? It's not because he's her cousin, because cousins got married all the time in England. Just like in ancient China, cousins married all the time. That wasn't the reason. The reason was because St. John wanted to be a missionary to India, and he wanted to bring a good helper with him, a good companion, and he thought that Jane would be a really good missionary wife. However, St. John was in love with a really beautiful, sexy, inappropriate woman.
I'm sorry. Boy, this book is crazy. Next sentence.
And it describes in a very convincing way. Here it becomes convincing again.
Right.
It was clear that he was not in love with Jane. He just made a very kind of dispassionate decision, just a logical decision that she would be a better wife. But, he had the hots for this pretty girl. And she was totally unsuitable for him. She was not educated, she was not nice, but she was gorgeous. And Jane saw that very clearly, and she said no. Okay?
Upon her arrival, she finds the house burned and discovers that Bertha died and Rochester lost a hand and was blinded in the fire.
So Jane makes a decision not to go with her cousin as his wife, to be a missionary to India, which would have been a really difficult and hard life. So she decides not to do that. She decides, maybe I should go back to Thornfield and see how Mr. Rochester is doing. So she gets to the house. Upon her arrival, when she gets there, she sees that the house has been burned to the ground. Thornfield Hall is no more. And she learns that Bertha died in the fire, and that Mr. Rochester lost a hand and also his vision. He was blind. Why? Because he was trying to save Bertha.
Despite his injuries, Jane is still in love with Rochester and marries him in the end.
Well, for one thing, he's now single.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the valiant thing he did, the really good thing that he did is he tried to save his crazy wife. He tried very hard, and that's how he got so injured. So if you say he's a really bad guy, I'm not convinced. I think that he tried to do his best with a bad situation.
When Charlotte Bronte died at the age of 38, she's still in a time when women weren't truly respected, even though people had come to learn that she was the female author of Jane Eyre, this incredibly successful book. The New York Times did not publish an obituary for her. An obituary is a story about your life after you die. 51 years later, her husband, because she died was just 9 months after her wedding, did get an obituary, which perhaps seems a bit unkind. However, it was just 5 lines long, but the headline tells you everything you need to know. The New York Times wrote, Charlotte Bronte's husband dead.
Okay, I highly encourage all of you to read this book, but don't read the original. It's long and difficult. Get a simplified version of the book. It's written in simple English. Don't think that it's a baby book. No, just read something that is easy to read and that you can easily enjoy.